under the guise of volunteers and supported by an even larger contingent from Mussolini's fascist Italy, mercilessly harrying the Republican forces to destruction. The tragedy was that no one had seemed to care. Or if they had cared, they had brushed their fears out of sight like dust under a rug. George's father had been one of them. He had dismissed the business of Czechoslovakia and the rantings over the Sudetenland by Germany's Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, regarded by some as a genius and by others as a dangerous lunatic, as a gigantic bluff. He had been convinced that the Czech affair would blow over, even though the Germans had mobilized their army in August 1938 and had seemed ready to back up their words by force. The illusions of John Yeoman, and millions of others like him, had been brutally shattered just a few weeks later at the end of September. At Munich, with all pretense of a joint Anglo-French resistance to the demands of Nazi Germany thrown aside, Prime Ministers Neville Chamberlain of Britain and Daladier of France had capitulated to Hitler. The Allies would not go to the aid of Czechoslovakia if German forces invaded her. Germany could have the Sudetenland, with all its resources and frontier defences. And what matter if Czechoslovakia was stripped naked, so long as the rest of Europe was saved from the spectre of war? So Chamberlain had returned to London, brandishing the Munich Agreement and proclaiming peace to a near-hysterical crowd. An uneasy, tenuous peace. Little more than a breathing space, bought by sacrificing the self-respect of Britain and France. And to John Yeoman, it had seemed that everything his friends had died for 20 years earlier had been wiped away by the stroke of a pen. The straight, shining line of a canal came up ahead, cutting the hurricane's track from northeast to southwest. The town over on the left was St. Quentin. Beyond it, the canal curved away towards Cambrai, 20 miles to the north and falling behind in the distance. St. Quentin, Cambrai. Magic names in Yeoman's vocabulary. They were names that had captured the imagination of his youth when, in the long winter evenings, he had eagerly devoured books that had taken him into another world. A world of singing wind and humming wires, of roaring rotary engines and the drumming of fabric stretched taut over a wing. The world of Mannach, Immelmann, Ball and Richthofen, young men of a lost generation who had carved out a legend in the sky of Flanders, far above the mud in which his father had crawled. George had wanted to fly for as long as he could remember. On leaving school, he had got a job in a provincial newspaper office. It had hardly been inspiring work, his duties consisting mainly of fetching and carrying and making tea. But at least he had been able to put a bit of money aside towards his ultimate goal, which was getting into the air. On his 17th birthday he had joined the nearest aero club, and after that he had lived only for weekends, cycling 20 miles for the privilege of half an hour in the drafty cockpit of a de Havilland Moth biplane. He had taken to the little machine readily and had gone solo quickly, after only 3.5 hours dual instruction. But it had been 10 months before his logbook showed the total of 19 hours that were necessary before he could take the test for his A license. The flying test had been divided into 2 parts. An altitude test on the student's ability to lose height properly and make an accurate approach to land, and a figure-of-eights test to prove that he was capable of making sustained and accurate steep turns. George had found difficulty with neither, and had passed the Royal Aero Club examiner's oral questions with a comfortable margin. He smiled to himself, recollecting. It had all been worth it. The financial sacrifice, the long hours spent in a freezing cold hangar helping the mechanics when there was no flying. There had been times, of course, when he had wondered if he was doing the right thing, like the time he had applied to join the Auxiliary Air Force, armed with his brand new flying license, only to be turned down flat. The rejection, however, hadn't seemed so bad when someone had told him that the auxiliaries were a toffee-nosed bunch of bastards anyway, and you didn't stand a chance of getting in unless you were in the habit of cavorting around the countryside after foxes. Fortunately, the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve had not